Um, so just to remind people, I guess, of what we talked about during the last CLE meeting. We mostly had a discussion around how we could enable use of extended support options for different types of software. We decided that third-party support, I think, is out of scope. So a one provider providing support for another product that's not manufactured by them. And we discussed kind of the intricacies of these different support options. So like extended support can have multiple levels of extended support. You might have 2 levels, you might have 3 levels, varies by manufacturer. It could change over time. Like Red Hat may change their support policies over time, and they might condense levels or extend levels of support. And then we kind of discussed how we would represent that in the schema. Yeah, so maybe I can show you the schema now and the changes that I made. Kind of a mock-up. So top level, we have, this should not be here actually, these versions. We have a definitions object, similar to how CycloneDX does it, with support definitions and their associated levels and the name of the support and a description of them as well. And then the idea would be that you reference these support levels from within your event types. So maybe I don't even have an example. Here's an example. So you might have you might have end of support, but only for a specified support level, right?
So using the word level and integers like that implies a
Yeah.
hierarchy.
Yes.
That concerns me for a couple reasons. One is that I don't know if that's always going to be hierarchical, but another is because inevitably we will need to add something between two consecutive integers. Is there a reason not to make it just be more like a support ID?
Yeah. Well, the reason for integers was basically for programmatic usage. Like imagine your client and you have to define what type of support level you have for a specific component, right?
Sure.
Like how would you actually do that? Because maybe the name of the support changes. I guess you would have to have some sort of lookup to basically find the ID of the support and then add it into like a configure
Right.
ticket. So maybe ID would work there.
Yeah, like so I think if it's so if you I think it's probably a foot gun to have somebody just assume that support level, you know, if it's got support level 1, then it's good. Like I think support is too nuanced for that. And unless we want to go develop like, you know, how if you talk about like roles versus permissions, like whenever you do roles alone, you always end up needing granular permissions and the roles end up not being hierarchical, like GitHub, for an example. And so like, unless you're going to go exhaustively develop the permissions, or in this case, like the traits or characteristics of the support, and then use the role or the support level as a shortcut, a shorthand for a specific collection of granular items, like unless we're going to do that work, which seems like a lot, it seems problematic to like bake in that assumption.
Yeah.
The the other thing you might want to consider, again, because to piggyback on Jordan's thing where it may not necessarily be hierarchical, and there's a lot of cases where things are not. Having an identifier for the support would be useful. And instead of referring to it as a support level, and this is just a suggestion, ignore it, use it, whatever. you might, and the reason I say this is because in Cyclone, right, we've got bomb refs, and those can refer to other things within the document, regardless of what serialization format it takes. So JSON, XML, protobuf, it doesn't matter. With JSON, this is a JSON only format. Theoretically, we could also use JSON pointer. So /definition /support / the object that you're specifically referring to. That would be an option.
Make it more like an enum and a,
Yeah.
So true. One other thing I'd like to point out here is that the majority, I think the majority of people will probably be using default support levels for components. And I think we should try and support not like if someone doesn't specify what support they're using, I don't know, this is just an idea. Does it make sense to default to the base support level? Is that something that we can say?
I don't think.
Or should it be specific? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that's the same question as like, should NPM have defaulted the license to ISC or whatever? It's like it's something in that bucket is the common case and it's fine. And so it's seems convenient to like have that be the default. But
right.
Like over time, it's turned out that we would all have been better off if everyone had explicitly typed in their license as opposed to, because then you can't know for sure if they picked the default explicitly or like affirmatively or if they didn't. And so support is not exactly the same as licenses, but in this case, like there is a huge difference between an affirmative support affirmative policy of support, and they probably just do what the rest of the ecosystem does by default, and it seems useful to distinguish those.
Okay, so
I think the other thing that would, again, to go off of what Jordan just said, I think capturing the positive assertion of something is really, really important. At the same time, the lack of support should not mean that there's no support. That should also be asserted. So if in fact we have no support, that should also be explicitly stated. I don't want ambiguity to arise if that field is not filled in.
Right. In other words, like unspecified is question mark. It doesn't mean anything. It means you have to go and find and like look for affirmative confirmation.
So I think, well, just on that point there, actually, though. So we do have event types that specify like end of support, right? So I don't think it would make sense to actually have a support object or definition. Like you might not necessarily need to define the support levels. Like you could potentially use the CLE without specifying support levels.
Right? That's true. But there definitely are use cases where someone will say that free support is over, but premium support continues, or support for bugs is over, but support for vulnerabilities continues, and things like that. And so it should be optional, but we definitely need the ability to tie an end of support event to a kind of support.
Okay.
So if people,
and possibly more than one, like maybe it could be an array of multiples. Go ahead.
So if people optionally choose to use support in the spec, it should not be ambiguous, right? It should all be asserted.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? Can you drill into that a little bit more?
Yeah, basically, again, no defaults, like Jordan said.
Right.
And if you don't offer support, that's also an assertion. So if you optionally use the support mechanism, then you have to assert all of it.
Okay.
Which means no support is one of the available support levels or support kinds.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I think we need to figure out the best way of conveying that, because an end of support with no support level with a no support level doesn't necessarily make sense. If you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, right. That's, I mean, we could decide that if you omit support level, end of
Yeah.
support ends all support. But I think if
Mhm.
we're going with a principle of uh avoiding of like making affirmative, like explicit decisions, like preferring
Mhm.
explicit decisions over implicit ones, then
Mhm.
then an end of support type should require one or more support levels or support IDs or whatever we want to call them,
Mhm. Mhm.
so that you have to say
So,
what kind of support you're ending.
okay. Yeah, I think it would just be one, and or unless we change this object because
Well,
it
no, but
has
it
a
could be more. It
specific.
could be that
Oh
at
yeah,
this
you could
date,
have multiple, I suppose. Yeah.
yeah, because you can have free bug fix support, you can have free security fix only support, and you can have
Yeah.
premium support, and maybe two of those ends on the same time, and you want to put them in one level. Right? And we could
Mhm.
require that be two separate events, but like most of
Yeah.
the time, it seems valuable to minimize the number of events
Mhm.
that are necessary to express a thing, as long as
Yeah.
that doesn't sacrifice clarity and ambiguity, or
Yeah.
and create ambiguity. Yeah.
Mhm. So the other thing about support levels is there's a potential conflict in the definition between a version of like a version event and
Mhm.
the support level, technically, right? Because we say end of support, this means that there is a transfer risk from the manufacturer to the consuming organization or user. All cybersecurity knowledge. So basically, there will be. This should be worded differently, but
Maybe potentially
you know,
encompassing,
yeah,
like, because it depends on this kind of support.
yeah. No further assistance is provided by the manufacturer.
Yeah, so yeah, we'll need to
So,
reword it a bit, but the support type indicates what kind of support is provided, and when all of the types are ended,
mhm,
like when there has been explicit. So I think that's something we can say, is that when
mhm,
all of the explicitly provided support types have ended, then no support is the explicit state, right? But if there are
yes.
no explicit support types provided at any point, then no support is not implied necessarily.
Hmm.
It's like it's likely, but it's you can't necessarily know that for sure.
Yes. It'll depend on the versions here as well.
Also, yeah, and we're just talking about for specific version ranges, like
Yes.
whatever version range. Like so when you indicate that something's support level, that usually
Hmm.
applies to a range, not a specific version. It could apply to a specific version, but usually you're going to say like version 2 has this kind
Hmm.
of support, and version 3 is out, and then another third
Hmm.
event would be version 2 has end of support of some kind, um, and it applies to that range of versions.
Yeah. Microsoft is an example that they'll have a specific version of software and a support level
Okay.
associated with it. So, and they're also a unique case because, typically they don't use any semver, they don't use version numbers. You'll just have a
Mhm.
product that has a
Mhm.
name almost like Office 2016. And
Mhm.
it is not supported after a specific date, basically. So,
Right.
and it will have
Okay.
support levels sometimes as well. So,
And I don't know if this may be a like a unrelated, but
yeah.
have we talked about how whether we indicate if something is open source or not, like perhaps by saying it's licensed or something, but like it is incredibly valuable to be able to like look at end of life information and say, I want to ignore the proprietary stuff, or I only want to look at the proprietary stuff. Because that tells you
Hmm.
like what you're like, especially if third party stuff is out of scope. If I want to find who's selling support for something, right, it's going to be very different based on if it's open source or not.
Hmm.
And that like that might that having that be a binary a Boolean is probably not useful enough, but like maybe using uh the like scan code clearly defined, which is like broader than SPDX, and indicating the license of a product, maybe that's sufficient. Um, like that's
Yeah.
probably a useful thing to include as with the publish events, because licenses can have time factors as well, right? If you're using the FSL, then 2 years after the publish date, the license is semantics change. So it is directly tied to the publish event.
Hmm. Hmm. Sorry, I'm just thinking about the open source, closed source stuff.
The
Right. I mean, and that can be inferred from the license. That's why I
Yeah.
was in my head I immediately jumped to
Mhm.
the license.
Yeah.
So Steve, we were talking about perhaps including the
Yeah.
license with publish events
I that
as a
was
way
one of
to
the
allow
use
filtering.
cases. Yeah, that was one of the use cases that I wanted to support, especially like change of licenses.
Mhm.
But early on, we nixed that use case. I don't remember the reason why, but I think it's an incredibly useful use case.
Isn't it? I don't want to say trivial, but like, can't you just deduce that information? Is that why it was nixed?
Well, a change of license that does not accompany a release is rare, I think. I guess it depends on the ecosystem, but like if you want to change the license of an npm package, you have to publish a new version. So you can't like retroactively change the license of something that exists in a way that's programmatically. I know you can, but like in a way that's programmatically determinable.
But for commercial proprietary software,
You
this
can't.
happens
Yeah,
all the time.
that's a good point. I mean, it seems pretty true. So if assuming we make an optional license field on a publish type, and we define the schema for that field, which would be, I'm assuming the like the clearly defined or scan code license identifier, then it seems not too complex to add another event type, which would be license change, and it just gives old license, version range, new license, and timestamps.
Yeah.
So
That seems fine.
And
Yeah.
it would be really, in addition to that, it would be really interesting to capture why the license changed. Like, was this a
Sure, you could
decision,
have
or was this
you could have like
a
a free
result of
text
some
field
other?
for that.
Well,
Yeah.
I was thinking about the example that you said, Jordan, in that, you
Mhm.
know, it's licensed for one thing, but 2 years after that release, now it defaults to something else.
Well, the semantics change, but it's still like, in other words, it's still licensed as FSL. It's just that it's like it's MIT after 2 years. So it's
Right.
not, that wouldn't have a license change event. That's just part of the semantics of FSL. But you do need to know that something was FSL at a certain date so that you can determine
Got it.
when those semantics kick in.
Got it. Okay. All right.
And since that can relate to support, and that like, I don't know, I think there's a pretty strong case for including the license field in a published type and a change of license event type. And it seems like it probably won't like slow us down too much to add that.
Yeah.
So it'd be
Yeah.
nice if everyone
I
agrees with that to do that.
I fully support the license change event because it's totally within our wheelhouse, as in like this is an event that has happened to a component. I don't,
Mhm.
I'm trying to like, could you maybe give me an example of like why it would be included on a as a field on a published event or something like that?
I mean, so in an ecosystem where the only code that's consumed in theory is published code, some ecosystems like npm have a programmatic means of conveying that information so that you don't need it anywhere else. You don't have to go look up the repo to find it. Some of them you have to go look up the repo to find it. But and I agree that I acknowledge that you could publish a package that claims it's license A, and you could have your publish event say it's license B, and that may create a question of which is it. But I assume that I think that in like an NPM package can claim it's MIT and have GPL as a license file in it, and that is it's an open question. But like, if the declaration and the license file are in conflict, I think everyone will assume that the license file wins. So since the declaration is more like a summary of the license file, and so similarly speaking, I think that if that this is more of a, like, it would be more just like extra metadata about the publish that is relevant to support and lifecycle, that then you don't, that you still, the source of truth is still not the event, it's what's ever, in the package, but it avoids the need to find an ecosystem specific or repo provider specific way of locating that information.
And I was just thinking you could technically attach any type of metadata to this publish event, like homepage, GitHub URL, potentially.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if we want to allow for that use case, we could add a unregulated metadata object or something that lets people put whatever crap they want in there, but license feels core and important enough to me that it should be a top level thing. And sorry, I see Salve's hand is up as well.
Yeah, just one comment. Some of the scenarios you are describing here also sound like some bug report needs to be filed. This is metadata that comes with is in the repository, and it is mismatched with something else. Which is it? And then resolve it and done. So we don't have to solve every scenario here. Some of it is just like a bug.
Yeah, and you could put out a license change that is effective as of the first date. Like you could publish it with license A, and then as of midnight on March 19th, and then you could say license change as of midnight on March 19th from A to B, and effectively it was never A at that point, right? Like, so you could, that's a way you could solve that problem that we don't have to design for because it's already in there. Because there would need to be an effective date different from like a published date, right? Like, or from like an event date for a change of license. And yeah, I see that right there, the effective date on support. So we would do the same thing for licenses.
Yeah, I do like the license change event. I think that's a really good one to add.
Yeah, I mean, if there's reasons not to put it on publish, let's talk about them now or in the future. But like, it seems if we have a change of license event, then it seems pretty like it avoids two events in order to start to begin a license because the publish is really the action that begins the licensing.
That's true. The change of event, you have no starting point.
Right.
You have no license starting point, basically.
Right. And the publish event is the license starting point. So that feels to me the natural place to put it. But like, if there's reasons why it shouldn't be there, that's fine. We can talk about that.
Sure. I don't see any reasons right now. Yeah. So I would support that, I think.
Cool.
All right. Anyone else have any questions that came up along the way when we were discussing this? No? Okay, cool.
I was just thinking, is this kind of stuff going to be like useful for things like, Dependabot to build in the intelligence to say, hey, hold on a second, I would normally do a PR to update this component, but if I did that, there would be a license change, so I got to put in something else.
Yes, and I don't think they do that yet, even for NPM, where they have the information all ready to do it. But that absolutely is would be a great feature of any dependency updating tool to like warn you about a license change, essentially.
Cool.
Yep. So one other thing I wanted to talk about as well was coming back to the kind of the JSON schema, creating a JSON schema for the spec potentially. And so I think Steve mentioned on the last call I think you weren't here, Jordan, but he mentioned basically that we should obviously try to use the very latest JSON schema because it's difficult to do kind of updates to the schema that you're using because your downstream tooling potentially uses different. But and then I was wondering if anyone had any more recommendations or like thoughts around adding in this JSON schema and around specifically versioning of the CLE itself. Is it safe to put a version string in the schema URL? Should we have a different top level version? Things like that.
I think, well, So I think when it comes to version and schema, it would be nice to make them. I feel I have I'm of two minds. Like one is that it would be nice to make them optional so that they default to the first version if they're not there. But also that makes it suck when people want to upgrade because then they have to add boilerplate. So maybe we just require it forever. I don't know. As far as the version in the URL, it does seem unfortunate if people have to infer the version by parsing it out of a URL.
Yeah, that was my thought as well.
Yeah.
I kind of want to, but then at the same time, it's like it's kind of annoying if you have to parse it.
Right. Well, and it would if we have both, then it sort of sucks because
Yes.
they could be out of sync. You could say this is version 1, but the schema is version 2. So like another alternative though is we could say that there is just a version number and everything in this spec plug the version number into this template and you get the schema. And that way the schema is directly implied by the version number. We have only one piece of information. And that also means that if we need to change the URL for some reason, we have a way to do that without needing to update a bunch of documents.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that's the simplest.
And we can always add a schema URL later if we need to, but like.
Yeah, I think the main, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but the main use case for JSON schema is just when you're editing it in your editor so that you can validate, well, all types of validation, but like
it's all types
primarily
of validation, yes.
All types of validation, but
yeah, I mean, it's like autocompletes for enum values and stuff, but for the most part, it's validation. But it is, I think it's really important that we have a way to validate the well-formedness of, this JSON data, but like, and JSON schema seems fine.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
And I agree that we should use whatever the absolute latest version of it is when we with our first version.
Yep. Cool. I think Steve dropped off, which is unfortunate because I thought maybe he'd have something to say about the schema, but oh well. So there was a thought, I guess, that came up last meeting as well, which is that I don't know, it keeps coming back, which is like it would be super easy if we're just designing a schema for open source tooling and open source projects. And that could support, I don't know, that could be used across package registries or something, or across code repositories. But when we start working with non-open source projects and we start working with commercial software or hardware and things like that, the scope, I don't know, the scope increases and
I think it makes sense to just restrict it to, well, if we're just open source software, I think if we include the license and do the scan code thing, then it's not just open source, it's anything that has a license that it understands. And there's like 1,500 or something types. Some of that is probably commercial software, but I think that we should just, among the group, we should say we're designing for open source software with the first version. If we become aware of a future need for things beyond that, then we will design with that in mind, with that later addition in mind. But that is going to be reserved for like a V2 or later. And in that way, we we should not design ourselves into a corner, but because we have the version, it doesn't matter if we do, we can just make a new schema. And that also like safely contains our scope, our design scope, so that we have a hope of getting this done in the next 5 months.
Yeah, totally.
Is anyone else on the call? Yeah, go ahead, Salve. Go ahead.
Yeah, because if we do as you say, kind of there's a bunch of new types of events that are specifically useful for open source projects that would have to be put in a timeline. Right now, for example, forking is already put out of scope, but if it's an open source project, it needs to be in scope because forking happens. And if something, say for example, a project is been taken under custodianship by the ecosystem people, that's actually important information to pass on downstream. And as a signal for users to know that if there's some security issues, they will be handled by somebody, but nobody is actually having full responsibility, or the project might still be open for adoption or something like that. And that's super important. But it means like if the scope for this project is going to be narrowed down to just open source, it will balloon just by the fact that we need to actually properly support open source projects. So I'm not sure if that's what we that's a constructive way to go.
The first version doesn't have to support every use case for open source projects or for anything. We just have to like think about it, like about not open source and non-open source stuff, so that we design with that extension in mind, right? Like if we know that there's going to be some kind of event in a future version of the CLE stuff, then like whether that's open source or not, then we just need to, like, if that's in our heads when we're designing what's in the first version, then we're not going to, you know, design ourselves into a corner, and that's all.
Yeah,
I certainly agree
fine
with you that like if we balloon the scope like you're describing, we'll never get done.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, we can still get done, but my point isn't to let it just grow without any form of control. But my point is more that there are aspects that are needed out there for it to be useful for open source projects to adopt. Because if it's not useful, if the CLE spec isn't actually real life useful, then this becomes an academic project, and the likelihood for a 2.0 to ever come out will just plummet, because like we're starting with a dead baby, so to speak. So I wouldn't want us to waste our time. So
no, I agree.
What is useful that has to go into the spec?
Yeah.
If the main audience is open source projects, that's the question we need to have a clear idea of.
Right. I mean, I think it will be useful if, given a Perl, right, just to cover a bunch of nuance, I can determine its current support status and its future support status, currently alleged future support status. Like if I can do that, whether it's for a fork or anything else, then sorry. There we go. Sorry, I had a phone call coming in. If I can determine that for any given Perl, I think it is immediately and broadly useful. And then you mentioned forks, right? And if I fork foo and I call it like foo-fork, the fact that there's a relationship between those is sort of irrelevant, because foo-fork has a support status and foo has a support status, and they're different. They might be the same, but they're distinct. So like that's my sort of guiding. I hadn't really verbalized it until you mentioned that, but like that's sort of what I think is my guiding vision here, is that, or not vision, desire here, is that I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to take a Perl, plug it in, and answer current and future support questions. Support status question.
Same.
Yeah. Salve, does that, like, do you think that with that as a goal, then that can guide what we include or defer?
Yeah, sounds good. Stephen, myself, we put some thought in it in the OSS Sustainability Working Group in the CycloneDX gang. We just finished our meeting before this one. And in that process, I have tried to figure out if there's, from a sustainability perspective for open source projects, meaningful to, if there's a meaning in trying to enumerate not only the ways, the expected types of support offered, or support levels or support types offered, but also what is required or asked for. So we have a support required list and a support provided list. And what you guys are doing is very much around what support is provided. And that's the silly point here. And on that list, I've tried to figure out what it kind of means for something to be casually maintained, for example. How much effort does that imply? It should, both for the to have a clear idea for the maintainer to decide, and so thereby communicate what levels they are willing to provide, but also for the users to get to manage their expectations, because they might want to, for example, ask for more support than the maintainer is willing to provide, and then initiate some sort of negotiation or ask if they want a co-maintainer to help them so they can grow the community and thereby increase the level of support. But all that stuff is right now, we on the sustainability working group, we're kind of leaning towards not taking some of this out of scope. Mostly the stuff that the ecosystem is involved in. Like, for example, the case where the ecosystem, people who run the packaging system, for example, I'm a CPAN person, a per person, so on CPAN we have a way to take custodianship of a package, something which is far upstream in the dependency graph and is important for many packages. If it isn't being taken care of, somebody will step up and do emergency fixes, for example. Let's call that being a custodian. And that's a useful information to communicate, that this package is currently not owned by anybody. So there's no support that can be provided. It's open for adoption. And possibly, if it's the circumstances are correct, it has a custodian that takes care of it until somebody steps up and takes responsibility. That's useful information for downstream when they want to know whether a package they depend on is has a that one can expect that the vulnerabilities are handled promptly, for example.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So how this fits in here, I don't know. Engine and I, we kind of had touched a little bit on this topic last week, but
so what I think the custodian thing in particular, I think, is related to a question that comes up a lot in NPM packages, which is, what should you do when the primary maintainership changes? When you bring on a new person who's going to be doing most of the work, or when a package is given from A to B. A few folks have a conviction that you should publish a breaking change, and note that in the change log. I don't share that conviction, but I also want people to know when a package has changed ownership, so that they, so that I know as well. So I think that there is an exploration to be done around that category of thing, of finding out who's running a package and when that changes. That feels like something that we could defer to a fast follow V2. But if it's something that, because I don't think it directly interferes with or impacts the goal I mentioned earlier of plugging in a Perl and getting out support status. But I would love to solve that. Does everyone else have thoughts on that category of thing? Different or the same?
I think I would love to say super focused on basically on just this one use case, because I think that is missing right now,
Mhm.
and it's extremely high value. I think it's also important to know who's running a project, but I think more like super immediate is like understanding the support levels if they exist. So I think there's some collaboration there eventually, but I just want to stay super focused because we have a deadline of later this year. I think we have like 7 or 8 meetings left. So yeah. Yes. So let me see what else. So there's 2 more things we could talk about. One thing we could talk. Oh yeah.
Sorry, I just to shoot in quickly on the version events that you added. And sorry to bring this up again, but there was something around the Cyber Resilience Act, which I mentioned in the Google Docs document that this is based on, which hasn't been included. Was there a reason for that? Because the end of available updates field that I talked about is that one is in the law right now, so it'll be required no matter by downstream users, the manufacturers that use this. I don't know.
Yeah. So my understanding was the end of updates was basically around distribution, where it's you need to have the software available for distribution for up to 10 years, right?
Yeah, or 5 years after its end of support.
Yeah. So like but my understanding is basically the manufacturer needs to, I guess it is interesting. It's important in a sense that it should tell you when you're no longer able to download this software, potentially.
Yeah, or get updates. Say, for example, if you have a switch or a router at home and you do a factory reset, you need to apply the fixes even if the support period has ended. So if you're not able to at least patch the known vulnerabilities up until this end of support date, after you have ended the support, you are basically asking people to never be able to do factory resets on their routers for the moment it isn't supported anymore, because you will just make them vulnerable again, and that's not acceptable according to the Cyber Resilience Act now, which means the law. So this is actually a field that which needs to go in, and so with a sensible name and a description, because it's a use case that is going to be real.
Quick question: does that requirement to have the software available for 5 years after the end of support, does that also apply to stuff like documentation? Because I quite often find that I can still find the software available for download, but I've got no documentation because the producer has just basically just deleted all their online documentation for old versions.
I'm not sure. I think it's quite possible that is the case, but I'm not sure.
Well,
I hope that it is the case.
Let me ask a different question.
Yeah.
Why do you need, like, I understand that the law requires you to keep distributing for some time after end of support. Why would anybody then, like, the only reason you would look at an event for end of distribution is if you found it if you weren't unable to locate it, right? And if it's within that time frame that it's legally required to be distributed, then they're not going to probably create an event because they probably didn't realize that they were taking it down or whatever. So there's no value in that case in having the event. And if it's after the legal time frame, then like I don't know. Like I guess I'm just wondering what's I hear you that people have to keep distributing, but what's the value of an event for it?
That's a fair question. I would let's say that's a very good question.
It's really just can you download the software or not is the real question.
Yeah, but so in a sense, if you cannot download the software anymore, then that's fine. But I think this is also about expectations. Like if you're not upfront saying that you will be able to do a factory reset for until 5 years after it goes out of support. End users might want to know about that so that they know that they don't actually have to. They don't have to get into a panic mode and buy whatever the moment something breaks. But maybe that's more useful for large buyers of products, so that they
because
get
that also only applies
to
things sold in the EU, and that law could change. They could increase that or decrease it at any time, and the previous promise is irrelevant.
I think the promise for a product that is put on the market gets to stay as it, but the law says that the market regulators can, depending on the type of product and expected life, how long it's supposed to work. For example, your washing machine might have a 10-year lifespan instead of a 5-year. Then it makes sense that any firmware updates that needs to be available for 10 years or more. Or just 5 years. It kind of depends. You have to. Needs to be. Somebody will be doing that for major categories of products.
That means that you have to know from a human standpoint what kind of thing this is, and then you have to know from a human standpoint what the law then maps that time frame to. And right, and at that point you can just do math from the end of support date.
I think it's fair and useful for a manufacturer to also have a way to communicate this to downstream their distributors and importers and customers, by explicitly telling this is the end of date, instead of asking people to do math and reading the law or figuring out the custom situation depending on the product. Just let them know the date, and that's easy, and you're not asking people to think.
I mean, that seems like something we could easily add eventually, but since that's only really a physical product consideration, it seems like.
No, this is for software.
Open source too.
Here's the thing. The Cyber Resilience Act applies to products with digital elements, and that sounds a little bit fuzzy. That's on purpose. So you could think any device that has software running on it, or has off-site or hosted software that it depends on in order to function normally. And that might include an app on a phone that requires some web server with an REST interface. Then that web server software and the stack there in the application that provides this is under the law, needs to be having the due diligence performed, needs to be produce an SBOM with the full dependency graph and all that fancy stuff, and have the correct documentation and the promises and the availability for updates if that's relevant. In the case where software on the device needs to be updated, that usually would mean something like an over-the-air type of live update or something like that, which means that there is some server where the new firmware image with the new version of the OS that runs on your washing machine gets downloaded from, so they can do a security update and do whatever. That server where you download the image is also under the law.
I think there's also one other reason why we couldn't support end of updates, and that is because of this clause that basically says must be kept available for 10 years after the publishing date of the update or until the end of the support period, whichever is longer.
Yeah.
So essentially it's computed based on, you may have a patch version release, and then you also have basically a end of support for that range of versions. And so you would need to compute basically whichever is longer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The manufacturer can compute it on your behalf and store it in a file that is provided like this, like a CLE document. That's my point. Make it easy for the consumers of this file to just know it. They don't have to think, they don't have to calculate. Calculating is easy, but it's also an additional step, so it might not be done and or create confusion or complexity. So why not just spell it out, make it simple? This is still an important field to add. So my recommendation is make it easy for the user and let the manufacturer do the complex things of adding dates. They can they have the money to do so, time and calories. I would say that's a reasonable expectation, at least. I'll see if I can find an updated link to the law, because the one I shared with you guys was the version that was the Parliament voted on, and not the published one in the official journal.
It would also need to be specifically for each update version.
Or the product? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure.
No, it's specifically for, it says it's for the update. Any update to the software published during this period needs to be kept available for 10 years.
Right.
Yeah. So it'd be easy if it was, you could tie it just a 10-year period after the published date. But you also need that support period. And then you need to parse the version strings. You basically would need to, if you're looking at the specification, you might have a version range here. You need to take all of the end of support version ranges and then compare them against the list of published releases. And then do this calculation. And then I think the point still stands, is like, what is the use case for the end user?
Like communicating the date in advance,
Yeah.
sure, but the end user's not looking at these events, right?
Yeah.
Like, not like regular humans. Yeah, we are at time.
Oh, shoot.
I did.
There are end users, by the way, that include importers and distributors. They also care about this stuff.
Sure.
They're a type of consumer.
Sorry, just I know we're out of time, but I would just slightly rewind a little bit on when we were talking about the version and whether it's the URI and everything. If this spec is meant to be valid JSON schema, and it seems like it is, the $sign schema field it does need to be a URI, and it actually needs to refer to the JSON schema, not on the CLE. So that should be the URI to JSON schema draft 2020-12. The field to identify the CLE itself would be the $sign ID field. So that's, I think, what we're looking for there. And that per the JSON schema spec, they both need to be URIs.
I think I was looking into, sorry, I was looking into this. I realized that this was inaccurate. So there's kind of two ways of using the JSON schema as a producer of the schema versus a consumer of the schema. Is that how it works? Like you basically have your own document and you add in a field that says, I'm using this schema in your JSON. Is that, am I off base there? Yeah.
So the $sign schema says what version of JSON schema itself, which is the meta schema, if you will.
Yeah.
$sign ID is what's meant to identify your specific schema.
Okay.
So
right, but these are both fields that are in the CLE JSON schema. It wouldn't actually be in CLE documents, like CLE compliant JSON documents. Like there's a JSON file full of CLE events. That doesn't specify the schema necessarily. But then there's a separate document that's like, this is the JSON schema for that other file full of events. And that file has to have $schema and $ID. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I'm on the same page as you.
Right, I know it's difficult to discuss out loud because there's like multiple JSON files. But
yes.
Yeah, so I think that the CLE events should have a version field at the top, and that's it. The schema itself needs to have $schema and can have $ID. That's fine.
Right. Like, so here's for like CycloneDX, for example.
Yeah.
BOM 1.4 has that.
Right. But the individual SBOMs don't have that. That's just the schema for those SBOMs that has that.
Yeah, it's optional if you want the bombs themselves. You can optionally put like in the schema field, you can optionally put like the ID of the schema that you're actually using.
Right.
So that you get automatic validation.
Right.
If you want.
Okay.
I got to jump. Sorry.
It's completely optional.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. See you next time.
Hey, Mike.
Right.